So good to have you all with us. I'm very pleased to introduce the brilliant Ettie, who's with us from Fighting Talk. Ettie is a communication educator specializing in inclusive and accessible language. And I know you've got a brilliant presentation for us this morning, Ettie. So I'll hand over to you with no further ado.
Thanks so much for that intro, Rosie. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for joining me this morning. I will start sharing my slides. Let me know if you cannot see them. Right, we're going to get into 5 practical ways to use inclusive language. This is obviously a brief overview to a massive topic, so bear with me as we go on a whistle-stop tour of some of the key ways that we can all become more inclusive communicators. So, a very brief about me. Thank you, Rosie. As mentioned, I am an inclusive and accessible communication educator. There's a GIF on screen of me flashing through images showing a white person with blonde hair. That's me. And I've worked with a whole range of charities all across the sort of non-profit world in the more climate related space, Greenpeace, and then in the more human rights space, people like Amnesty International, Plan International, Action Against Hunger, and lots of other wonderful folks. So we're going to get into 5 practical ways to use inclusive language in our everyday roles. And I just want to start by taking our minds away from the idea that there is one right way to be inclusive. There is no single correct way to be inclusive. Instead, there are many ways, many infinite possible ways to be inclusive. For example, if we were try to answer the question, what language do autistic people tend to prefer, as if there was one single correct answer all the time, always, we would be a little bit stumped because research finds that a great majority of autistic folks like to say, I am autistic, between 70 and 90% of autistic people when you conduct research. But a minority like to use person first language. I have autism. And whilst that majority is a really, really, really big majority, it's not everybody. So we can learn about that language approach, which is called identity first language. I've got resources on it. I can share it with you all afterwards for anyone who's interested. It's great to know the pattern. It's really important to know the trend, but there is no single answer to that question about how to always speak about autism with everybody everywhere. And I will refer you to my Substack afterwards. It's a whole bunch of paywalled learning resources, but I'm going to provide free access for anyone who would like it for 1 month. If you want to have a look through the archive and get a whole load of resources on things to do with disability, gender, social justice, accessibility, neuro inclusion, and all kinds of good things. So, like I mentioned, sometimes there are strong patterns. Sometimes there is a majority who prefer a particular approach to language, but it's still not everybody. And that's why we've got to be person centered, flexible, and nuanced, because there's no single right word for any issue or any identity. It's going to depend on your context, your community, who you're speaking to, what kind of action you're trying to move them to, and lots more. So, as I go through, I'm not going to be presenting rules as though there is always a correct way to say things or that you must never, ever, ever say these words. If you do see a green tick emoji, it's just there to indicate suggested, encouraged, maybe something to consider. And if you see a red cross emoji, it's just to suggest challenging, being curious, pausing and reflecting on if that might be the right word choice. But it will depend on your situation. So we don't need cut and dried rules, we need principles. And I've put an image of a diving board over a swimming pool, partly because doesn't that look lovely? And also as a metaphor for a leaping off point, a point that we're going to jump from into our own context and make decisions that make sense in our particular worlds. So let's get into some of those principles. But before I do that, I have a question for you all, and I would love if you could answer in the chat. Why does inclusive language matter? It could be a word, it could be a phrase, anything that pops to mind when I say, why does inclusive language matter? It could be a feeling, it could be a personal interest of yours. I'm not looking for full technical answers in perfectly worked out sentences. I'd just love to know what pops to mind. I'll take a little moment to give us processing time and typing time, and then I'll read out some responses in a sec. Wonderful. Invites people in, acceptance and being seen, creates trust, action, makes everyone feel important because people matter to keep people on board rather than alienate them. So everyone can access your content, be able to understand and use it without barriers. Equity, equality, we're all in this together. All right, I'll have to pause reading there. These are brilliant. Thanks so much, folks. Keep them coming. Do keep on reflecting about why language matters to you. So, a big yes to everything that you've shared in the chat there. A few that I might also say that come to mind for me are that inclusive language can help us to remove shame and blame where they don't belong, to foster safety and belonging and connection, to clearly highlight the actual causes of injustice, partly so that we don't scapegoat people, and partly so that we can tackle inequity by getting to the real causes. It can welcome, include, and centre people who have often been excluded, and it can boost understanding and autonomy, which helps to create action. And some of that overlaps with accessible language, which is about using simple, clear, literal language, writing in a way that works for assistive technology. And whilst that's not our topic today, there is some overlap between accessible and inclusive communication. Accessibility basically being writing and speaking in a way that works better for disabled, neurodivergent, tired, distracted, and so on people. And actually, a lot of those needs apply to all of us at any given time, even if we're not yet disabled. All right, so my next question for you all, and again, I would love words, phrases, anything that pops into your mind. What does inclusive language look like? So you could share an example of a behavior, an action, a context. You could share something that it doesn't look like if you find it easier to think of the opposite. I'll just give you a little bit of time to think about what that might look like, and then I'll start reading some out in a moment. Clear and unbiased, it's not jargon, simple and descriptive, person or community-centered language. It looks different for each audience, avoids bias based on the norm, recognizing historical context, no acronyms, imbued with loving kindness, plain and simple. Wonderful. Okay, again, a huge yes to all of this. So, three little random examples that popped into my mind. I thought about how interpersonally, when we're in a space with someone, it might be taking the time to learn to say their name properly. In a meeting like this, it could be sharing our pronouns if we're comfortable, maybe having it in our display name or on our slides when we introduce ourselves. More broadly, and in particularly in written storytelling, accurately describing injustice. And those are just three little examples, and it's many, many more of these things. And it's just like you all said. Love that one. Using words that relate to real life. Absolutely. So, overall, I think inclusive language, we tend to know it when we see it because it quite often looks and feels clear, simple, accurate, specific in the sense of not making sweeping generalizations, and it's deeply, deeply informed by relevant people's perspectives. It assumes that people are the experts in their own lives and they should get to decide the language that is used about them and how they can self identify and where they want the focus to be. So let's get into it. Let's find out these five principles that can help us in as we're trying to find words that relate to real life. So, my first principle, and I want to be clear, this is not exhaustive, right? Inclusive language is going to do lots of other things as well as these five. But the first one I want to talk about is reflecting reality. Reflecting reality means using words that are properly accurate and properly describe the world as it is. One example of that might be being specific. If you're talking about people in general, in the sense of a big group of people, you might use an umbrella term. Umbrella terms are things like LGBTQIA plus people. That's a massive umbrella that includes things like genders, sexual orientations, characteristics of like sex differences, so like intersex, and a whole load of other things. It's really, really broad. People of the global majority, that describes the like 85% of the world that is Black, Asian, Indigenous, mixed heritage, basically everyone that's not white. That is a massive umbrella term of lots of different people. Neurodivergent, that includes ADHD, autism, dyslexia, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and lots others. The global south. Anyway, I'll stop because I think you get the point. These umbrella terms are broad and that can be useful. Sometimes we do need to group people together, but we should be cautious because when we group people together, sometimes that can obscure important differences in people's wants, needs, and traits. If you're genuinely talking about that whole group, of course, please keep on using the umbrella term because you're actually talking about everyone in that group. But just watch out for using the umbrella term when you actually mean something more specific. There's some fascinating research, particularly from newspapers, that finds that as a society, we tend to generalize more and more about the people who have least power and privilege. And we tend to get more and more specific about the people, I think I said that the wrong way around. The people with the least privilege are most generalized about. The people with the most privilege tend to be described in a very specific way. It's rare that you'll hear people generalizing about the straight white male community. It's much more common that you will hear them generalizing about the people who are designed out of power and designed out of autonomy. So be as specific as possible, be accurate. So here's one example of being accurate. If we said both genders are affected by the climate crisis equally, well, we would be lying because that's not true. But if we were to say this event is open to both genders, that's not really accurate because if you identify as a man or a woman, fine, but there are lots of other genders. You could be gender fluid, you could be non-binary, you could be something else. So when we say all genders or when we say everyone or everybody, we're just being more accurate. We're giving terms that make sense to other people in the room, no matter who they are. One that's, I'm sure, closer to home, when we think about the origins of a term like global warming, invented by a political aide of President George Bush, invented to quote him, to make it sound like Boston will become a little bit more like the Florida Keys, designed with this intention of softening and sort of making climate chaos and climate breakdown seem like not that big a deal. We can see that that's just not an accurate term. And many people moved to drop that term. We might remember back in 2019 when news outlets like The Guardian said, we will no longer say global warming, we will say global heating, we will say climate crisis and breakdown. That's not to say that those specific words are always right for you and who you're talking to, but it is about being accurate to the scale of the issue and the action that is required of us, and watching out for terms that might have been created to make certain people feel good and to sort of pull the wool over our eyes and stop us seeing issues. So, those are just a few ways in which we might reflect reality. There's loads of other ways that you can be accurate. Those are just some provocations and starting points to think about. Principle two, identifying the causes of injustice. So, what do I mean by this? When I talk about injustice or inequity in the broadest sense, I basically mean we know that not everyone has access to the same resources, opportunities, and safety. And the ways that we talk about that can shape the types of actions we support, how seriously we take that inequality, what we do to tackle it. So I have a question for you all, which is what kinds of inequality show up in your work? This could be anything. It could be within your own teams. It could be talking about who's in leadership. It could be who's affected by access to green space or food, or who has, amazing examples coming through. Funding, access to green spaces, power imbalance between academics and community groups, access to education, class, digital capabilities, access to public transport, volunteers versus staff, food, absolutely brilliant. All of that. People who've been there longer and who therefore maybe know more. Job security, race, free time of different genders, caring work. Absolutely. Okay, brilliant. So these are all super, super helpful. Lynn, being vegan seems to make people angry. Fascinating. Sometimes there's something there about other people feeling attacked by other people's choices. Um, Very, very interesting. Okay, so some other examples we might think about. How are we talking about waste and pollution? We know that racially minoritized people are exposed to much higher levels of toxic waste and air pollution. The just transition, the fact that formerly colonized countries are more affected by climate chaos when they didn't really have a hand in creating those conditions. We've got the way that disaster responses are unequal and tend to harm certain groups like disabled people, women and girls, and so on. So let's not worry too much about the specifics because, like I said, we're going with overview, overarching principles that we can apply to anything. Let's instead think that whatever the forms of inequality we are talking about or writing about, we have a choice. We have a choice in terms of how we present that inequality. Inequality does not just happen, it is created by policies, by design, by systems, by social norms. And if we talk about that inequality as though it's natural, normal, or inevitable, research finds that it is harder for people to imagine alternatives. People find themselves saying things like, that's just the way it has to be. That's just dot, dot, dot. And then they say a kind of more fatalistic statement about the way power is divided. Instead, if we talk about the causes of inequality and we name the structural barriers, the policies, the design choices behind that, research finds that we make it easier for people to imagine alternatives. And I know that we're all doing such different work in such different organizations, but I know that for all of you, there will be an element of getting people to imagine the alternatives and care about them and make space for them in their lives. So the broad tip here is to name the barriers, name the policies, name the design choices that created inequality, whatever you are talking about. And a related tip could be calling for systemic solutions to systemic problems, which, like I say, I'm sure we're all doing already. Now, an example of this, one that makes me chuckle a little bit, we've got on the left a screenshot of an article by Rebecca Solnit. Big oil coined carbon footprints to blame us for their greed, keep them on the hook. So that's referring to the fact that BP, which was then British Petroleum, literally came up with the concept of the carbon footprint to present something huge, global, and systemic as an individual failure to get us thinking in terms of individualized blame. And we've got a social media post from BP saying the first step to reducing your emissions is to know where you stand. Find out your carbon footprint with our new calculator and share your pledge today. We have a reply from Andrew Henderson that says, I pledge not to spill 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Why do I share this? Rosie, I can see you chuckling. Because if we talk about individualized solutions to global systemic problems, we know that that increases feelings of, I've just forgotten the word, what's the opposite of autonomy? The one that's like hopelessness, apathy, feeling like this is too gigantic. How are my little individual actions going to help with this? Versus if we're able to speak about the systemic causes and also situate the role for appropriate individual action within that, that can also lead to us feeling less inappropriate shame and blame for things that aren't our fault. So, if you possibly can, do talk about the causes of injustice so that we're not blaming for people that don't really sit within their responsibility. Now, really closely linked to this, we've got principle number 3. I've called it put blame in the right place. To be honest, it's not really about blame exactly, but let's get into this one. It's actually a linguistics concept called loaded language. So, loaded language is any term for words and phrases that include a heavy judgment, like a moral judgment about the people in that group. So that's the sort of blame I'm talking about here. Blame on the level of our individual word choices. And when we use that loaded or judgmental language about people, we present them as bad or shameful, and we are making a judgment that it would be better if they were not like that. So it's stigmatizing and it's also judgmental. Some examples might include hard to reach populations, when in fact it's probably a bit more accurate to talk about hard to reach services or ways that they have been systematically marginalised. Wheelchair bound, quite judgmental, quite loaded. All my friends who are wheelchair users like to say things like, I am a wheelchair user. It's factual, it's not stigmatising, and it more accurately describes the way that a wheelchair can be very liberating. Judgmental language in a sort of health or disability context could be something like afflicted with Parkinson's. Loads of stigmatizing language still being used in medical healthcare all the time. We can say that someone has Parkinson's, that they live with Parkinson's. We're not saying that it's a wonderful time and their life is really easy, far from it, but we don't need to use this heavy, loaded language that implies that it is a terrible tragedy that they are living with this thing and that their life is somehow beyond the realms of our imagination. So that's what we mean by this loaded language with heaviness. Another really loaded phrase would be saying sexual preferences for everyone that isn't heterosexual. You never hear people describing straight people as having sexual preferences or the straight lifestyle, but you do hear people talking about gay lifestyle or the gay agenda in certain news outlets, and it's just really loaded and judgmental. So those are a few random examples of how loaded language can show up. The general reason that it matters so much is because the research shows that it shapes the actions we take. So Research, particularly this, a lot of it does come from the disability space, but there's also more across like business and psychology, finds that judgmental, pitying, or morally loaded language increases harmful stereotypes, and that leads to fewer opportunities being given to the affected groups. So, quite a lot of the research looks at older or disabled people and finds that loaded, judgmental language about them leads to people in the other group thinking they're not like us, they're inferior, they don't need the same support as us. Let's not even give them opportunities to test them out, to show their abilities. Now, here is a great statement from a piece of research by Disability Rights UK and the Climate Coalition. So it's a factual statement. They are saying climate change is increasing the numbers of disabled people. And they share this as a brilliant example of how to just talk factually and accurately about a process that is taking place. It's not falling into the trap of this kind of judgmental language. If we said that climate change increases the risk of becoming disabled, that encodes within it a little judgment about the idea that disabled people's lives are perhaps less desirable. We can still talk about statistical chance. That's the same concept, but with the judgment taken out, without that loaded heaviness on it. So be factual and try and describe situations and conditions as simply as possible so that we can see what we're really talking about. If you're not sure, and depending on the nature of the kinds of storytelling that you're doing, the type of content that you're creating, it's not always possible. But if you're not sure, ask people. And if you can't ask people, listen. Listen, you can do social listening. You can go onto Reddit and Instagram and Twitter and other social media platforms and find out how are people talking about this and mirror their language back to them. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions in terms of words that we wouldn't unquestioningly mirror. A lot of you will be familiar with reclaimed slur terms. An example would be that for us disabled folks, we have reclaimed the word crip, which has history as a really harmful slur term. We've reclaimed it to use it joyfully about ourselves, but if you're not yet disabled, it wouldn't be an appropriate term to use. So watch out for words that have a history of being used as slur terms, and otherwise do show people that you hear them, that you see them, and that you understand the way they're seeing themselves. So, those are just a couple of tips on this idea of putting blame in the right place. It's not to say that there is always blame to be, put into language whenever we're talking about anything, but if you want to steer clear of loaded and moral judgment, generally you'll be better able to describe things in a factual way. Principle number 4, have a positive impact. Words can drive behaviours. They can shape the way we perceive reality. For anyone who wants to take advantage of the offer of exploring the learning resources on Substack, you'll find a whole load of pieces about the science of how language shapes the way we see the world. So I could go on a long tangent here, but I must rein it in. We know that words can shape the way we see the world. So we need to choose words that drive action, appropriate action that supports our missions. And at this point, I thought it might be interesting to think about euphemisms for a moment. So I have a question for you all. What is a euphemism, or what comes to mind when I say euphemism? What comes to mind when I say euphemism? No worries at all if you haven't heard of it. I'll define it in just one moment. Brilliant. Minimizing an issue, avoiding the subject, making something sound better than it is, passed away rather than died, making something oblique to avoid discomfort, sort of being indirect, something you say when you don't want to be direct, sugarcoating, when you're talking about one thing but you mean another, a softer term for something that is quite direct. Brilliant. Great, great, great. Thank you so much. All right. So, yeah, we've got an image of a present wrapped up in wrapping paper and silky ribbon on screen because euphemisms are basically elaborate ways that we talk around something that we consider impolite or improper. Quite often, something that we consider unclean as well. There's a lot of euphemisms for things like going to the bathroom. Now, they're not always a bad thing at all. They can be very useful in some contexts. You might, if you're talking to somebody in person and they've recently been bereaved, you might want to use a euphemism for death, like she's passed on, has passed away, or is in a better place. And there is research that finds that for in-person conversations with an individual, euphemisms around death are often appreciated and can feel safer and more respectful of that person's emotions. There is research the exact opposite way in writing. So if you're writing about death and bereavement, it is better to use really clear literal language and say the person who died. because it reduces confusion. Like I mentioned before, lots of euphemisms about going to the bathroom, maybe saying, I'm taking a comfort break. That can be great. We don't always need to know exactly what someone is doing and why. It might be too much information. So, like it was mentioned in the Rosie said it's a tool, can be used rightly or wrongly. Exactly. So euphemisms are a tool. But there are some settings where euphemisms can get pretty dangerous. And it's when we use them to talk around certain identities, race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, neurodivergence, that kind of thing. When we're talking around an issue or an identity, that can increase stigma because the idea being that our brains register, this other person isn't just saying the thing they mean. There must be something a bit undesirable about that thing. If they're not just talking about sexual orientation or race or whatever it is, probably, our brains sort of attach some kind of judgment to that other person. So the research on this is super interesting. And what's amazing is that we can counter that stigma by just talking in factual, clear terms about these identities. So let's look at just one example from disability. Some euphemisms that many of us might have been taught when we were younger. They might have said, don't say disabled, you should say differently abled, handy capable, or special needs. Any reactions to these terms? How do we feel about them? How do you feel about these words and phrases? Christina's saying confusing, to be honest. Heather, they feel cringy. Caroline, condescending. Infantilizing, too generalizing. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, there are some situations where we can use that term. If someone's going to use it about themselves, I'm never going to come in here and tell other people how they should self-identify. That's totally their choice. But if we're speaking in broad terms about another group, I would say these are clear examples of euphemisms. Simple, standard terms that are clear, that are hard to misunderstand would be I am disabled. The vast majority of disabled people in the UK like to say that we are disabled, and a small percentage like to say I have a disability. It's clear, it's factual, it's avoiding some of that judgment. Nikolaus, I love your point here. You say it sounds like privileged people being squeamish about talking about a subject. Yeah, brilliant. And Liz is saying, I prefer direct, say it how it is, politely language. There's also another angle to this in terms of saying what we actually mean, because for lots of us, it's confusing. And there's loads of different reasons. So if you have had a very poor night of sleep, that massively affects your cognitive function. Sleep deprivation can have an effect very similar to having survived a stroke or some kind of acquired brain injury. That's just literally one example. Money worries can also really affect your cognitive function, make you much less able to understand and process stuff. And I'll just focus on neurodivergent people here for a moment because I am neurodivergent and I find this really interesting. So, for lots of us, including many autistic people, we are really literal thinkers. So, we benefit from literal language. And I think I forgot to put a slide in defining what I mean by literal language. But what we mean here is using words according to their dictionary definition. Literal language would be it's 100 degrees Celsius. Sorry, literal language would be water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. That's literally true. Figurative language would be you don't need a jacket, it's like 100 degrees outside. It's not literally true, it's figurative. Literal language would be the gymnast bent over backwards. Figurative language would be we bent over backwards to meet that deadline because it's not literally true. So, when we're trying to speak in a way that works better for everyone, including many neurodivergent folks, it's really, really important that we just say what we mean. And linking back to that research piece that I mentioned a moment ago about how it can increase stigma around things like disability and sexual orientation, it's really important that when we're talking about human beings and their identities and traits, we say exactly what we mean. It's also just more neuro-inclusive to say exactly what we mean. So, like I mentioned, there's nothing wrong with having any kind of minoritized identity, like being gay or disabled or anything else. So, we can use really simple, standard, clear, factual terms to reflect that. And same point as before, if you're not sure which term to use, ask people, ask directly affected people, and listen closely to how they describe themselves. Now, that was talking about humans, people with traits and attributes, but it also applies beyond the sphere of humans to talking about events, concepts, and ideas. We still want to say exactly what we mean. I have spotted a few climate euphemisms out there. I didn't have to dig very deep. These were quite easily found in certain sort of not very good media reports and so on, and often like hostile and critical pieces. We had people talking about climate alterations, atmospheric variability, ecological mismatch, planetary transformation. That one sounds like a nice thing. Climate imbalance, changes in climate, and this one, absolutely extraordinary, from an article about the decimation of Alberta's tar sands, was boreal forest overburden is being cleared. So, this is a really clear example of euphemisms being used in a hostile way to close us down from understanding the scale of the issue, what's really happening, and what we need to do about it. So, we can all watch out for this and we can all consider it perhaps. A mission to go on euphemism watch. Can you hunt down euphemisms where they're being used by people to close down our understanding? And can you challenge that and use more specific and accurate terms? I'd love to know if there are any other euphemisms that you see in your world, in your life. So, question in the chat, any other euphemisms that you see that come up in your work or in your sort of context? All good. I'll move on then. All right. So that was all about thinking about impact, thinking about the actions that we are encouraged to take. Oh, lovely. Thanks. Karen's talking about greenwashing. Absolutely. Richard, you're talking about the carbon problem. Fascinating. What carbon problem might that be? We know that when we dig into it, it is a much more specific issue. It's really important that we name it. Turbulent times from Neve. Yeah, really, really interesting. Perhaps there could be a situation where you want to briefly name that things are challenging and difficult. There could be trauma-informed reasons that we don't want to get hyper specific about the exact details of what we're talking about. You know, maybe we don't want to trigger climate grief or anxiety or talk about a distressing event right away. It's totally fine to say, like, to not immediately give away all the contours of everything you're talking about in an email subject line or at the start of a conversation. But euphemism is when we're trying to hide. Heather, neurospicy, fascinating. Some neurodivergent people do like neurospicy. Personally, where I'm at, I see a lot of opposition within the neurodivergent community. Lots of neurodivergent folks, particularly black and brown neurodivergent folks, saying that they do not like the term neurospicy. I also see a lot of us within the community saying that it's kind of infantilizing and so it doesn't align with how we feel. But if someone wants to self identify that way, like I said, I'm not going to go around telling anyone exactly how they ought to use language. Marvelous. All right. So moving on from those examples of euphemism, Rosie's shared developed or developing, third or first world countries, global north and south, industrialized or non-industrialized. For me personally, I do often find the industrialized or non-industrialized distinction can be quite helpful. Maybe that's just a me thing, and I can see how that could also be quite euphemistic and not really be talking about things like colonization or other factors. Seshan says land use change might be used to mean natural habitats are used up for agriculture or development. Very good point. So, yeah, the same term could be referring to something in a lot of detail or not so much. And Vicky says global majority or versus minority. I get them tangled. So it can be a bit confusing if we're from, let's say, the UK and we think of white people as the majority. But in a global sense, global majority is the 80 to 85% of people in the world who are black, brown, indigenous, Asian, mixed heritage. So if we keep the global in the phrase, it helps us remember global majority and white people are the global minority. But yeah, if we just hear one word on its own, it also gets confusing. Okay, brilliant examples. So let's move on to the final recommendation here. And it's so simple. It's so basic. It is to call people to action because inclusive language, in my opinion, is language that helps us understand the issues that we're dealing with so that we can move towards appropriate action. And calling people to action can very literally mean that. It can mean inviting people to take all the types of actions in terms of lobbying and campaigning and marching and everything from the tiniest actions they take in their everyday life, in their own homes, to sort of political actions too. That's part of it. But it can also mean lots of other things. So I want to encourage us to really expand our idea of what it means to call people to action. Because I think you can call people to action every time we expand our ideas of what is normal. Every time we use language that like decenters certain people as the default human being. It's a lot of language that passes unnoticed every day that sets sort of men and not yet disabled people and white people as the default human being. You see it all the time when somebody uses diverse to describe one individual. We have a diverse new hire. And really, that's a euphemism for saying like that they're not white or that they're a woman or another gender or something like that. So every time you pause and reflect on your language and you slightly decenter who gets presented as normal, I think you are calling the world to action. It can also be including diverse perspectives. So, literally, sharing often ignored stories, looking out beyond the types of stories that you've mostly been telling within your organization, the people you've mostly been interviewing, whatever has historically been done, which probably is on the narrow side, and looking broader. And it can be checking in with people. So, you might have heard people talking about microaggressions and micro affirmations. And a micro affirmation can be something as small as saying, "Can I just check I'm saying your name right?" So simple and yet so powerful when it's done effectively and repeatedly. It can be checking that you're presenting stories that feel accurate and that land with people. And I would really invite you to add anything else to this list in terms of anything else you can do in order to call people to action. So feel free to share anything that comes to mind when you think about how the words that you use and the stories that you tell can help create action. Whether that is formal, literal, very obvious, large actions, or teeny tiny micro actions in the everyday. So I'll move on, but I will also read out anything that comes up in the chat in just one moment. Oh, lovely stuff. Anna's saying, thanking people for sharing their experience and time. That's huge, particularly given the inequity in terms of who has free time to volunteer or be part of a participation, for example. Helen, reminding people who use gendered language when they just mean people. Katie, giving people the option to ask questions in chat as well as say them verbally. Yeah, brilliant. Sharing positive stories of change and specific examples, paying people for their time, super important, or even better, paying them. Make sure the action that you're suggesting is doable for people. This came up in a call to get people outdoors. We need to consider accessibility, for example. Respecting where people are at now, then bringing them with you, asking people their preferences, creating space for less dominant people to speak and contribute, apologizing. I don't know why people started telling us we shouldn't say sorry when we send an email late or miss something, calling in rather than calling out. Okay, fabulous. Loving all of these. Thanks, folks. So, whatever you choose to do, please don't worry too much about finding the exact right term for something or someone. It is very, very, very rare that there is a single correct term for the issue or topic that you're talking about. It's very likely that there are multiple inclusive opportunities. So, try and use clear, simple, factual, neutral terms. Listen deeply to people, ask them, and adjust based on feedback from relevant people. We know that language evolves. I've got lots of resources on it for anyone who wants to learn more. So evolve with it. Adopt a mindset of evolution and progress, not perfection. Progress just means that we do a little bit better every day. Perfection can cause us to freeze and cause us to overthink and mean that we don't do anything or don't say anything. So I'll pause there and I'll share a single sort of if you do one thing after today invitation, which is to pause. That's it. That is the action. If you do one thing after today's session, I would love if you could pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, can I tweak my language? Is there a more accurate way that I could say this? Is there someone I could ask? Is there a community I could check in with? Just take that moment to pause and take a breath. Doesn't mean that you have to change what you've been saying, but give yourself that chance to reflect. So remember, progress, not perfection. And I will go to time for Q&A now. So reminder that you can access a month free of my Substack, but you'll get information about that in an email afterwards to keep it simple. And we'll go to questions now.
Ettie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, and you've given us a lot to go away and think about. I know I've made loads and loads of notes as you've been going along. We've got some time now for questions, and we have got a few in the Q&A. If you could pop them in the Q&A rather than the chat, it will help me keep track of them in between everybody's comments. But we have got a few people just sending their thanks and for sharing such brilliant presentation with us, Ettie. So huge thanks for all of that. One of the things that has coming up in the questions is finding the correct term can change, can't it? We all want to get it right, but things like the global majority can use issues or offence when it's being used. Is there a right term? Is there a more appropriate term that we should be using, Etty?
So there is no single correct term for how we talk about racism or race. It will depend on who you are. It will depend on where you are. It will depend on if you're speaking as an organization that is majority Black and you're talking about your own experiences of anti-Black racism. It's going to be different language if you are maybe speaking as an organization that is majority white and might have a different relationship and might say different statements about how we think about race. So I would always caution against trying to find a single correct term. I know many activist communities where people really feel like people of the global majority is the term. They're like, we love it. It's accurate. It's true. 80 to 85% of the world is Black and brown, Asian, Indigenous, and so on. But if it doesn't make sense to you, if you don't know what that term means, I would say it can also be really inaccessible. And with my other hat on, with my accessibility hat on, I would say we have to be using words that people understand and can understand quickly, not with a long, complex technical introduction or by, having to check out external links. It's got to be words that make sense in our own life. So if that's not true of the community that you're part of and who you're speaking to, then I would say absolutely feel free. Like, do not use that term that's not going to make sense to people and just listen deeply and find out what that term might be. Another one that I love using because I think it's really accurate, not necessarily accessible, is racially minoritized, right? Because minoritized is all about how society designs certain people out of power. Women are considered a minority. We're actually more than half of the population a lot of the time. So we're not a numerical minority, but we are minoritized in the sense that we're not expected to hold power and be in senior leadership. So for me as an inclusive language person, I'm like, what a brilliant term which accurately describes something that's happening in terms of racism. For lots of people, they're just like, okay, that's like two really long words. I don't really know what either of them mean. The other one sounds a bit similar to ethnic minority, but it's not. And I would say that's such a clear example of like not the term to use for your community if they're baffled by it, if it doesn't make sense to them. So really lean into what's going to resonate, what makes sense to people, and pay attention to the questions that you get because you might test out using lots of different words in a meeting, on your website, in policy materials, and then you might get questions. And when you get that question from someone that's like, what on earth does that mean? Or I thought that that was like this, that's really valuable data. So gather it all and be willing to adjust as much as you can and find whatever's right for you. It's going to look different depending on who you are and what your context is. And if anyone wants more specific guidance, do feel free to get in touch with me and I can talk you through in really specific ways. But I think the main takeaway is, lean into what feels right for you.
Thank you, Etty. And that's a really important point. There's lots of people who are interested in getting in touch with you or interested in having you come and talk to their work colleagues and da da da. And some of your resources are going to be available after this, aren't they? Could you tell us I think we had a question answer earlier about your resources being available and how we get those after this session.
Absolutely. I'll put it in an email. Basically, you just need to send your email to me, and then I will set up free access for a month for anybody who wants it. But I'll put it in an email because I think it's a bit easier getting it, in writing rather than me saying it out loud now. But all in good time.
Etty has posted her email in the answered questions in the Q&A, and it will also contact with her Substack page will be sent out as part of the delegate resource pack after the conference. So lots of ways that you can be getting in touch with Etty. And I think bringing your colleagues and on board with you and bringing them on this journey, changing a mindset can be really challenging. How can we sort of help our colleagues when we spot them using non-inclusive language or in a meeting call or on social media? How can we encourage our whole organisation to sort of come with us?
I think we can start by adopting a mindset of joy and positivity. If it feels right for you, I'm not telling you that you should feel joyful about it. Personally, I do find inclusive language really joyful because it's all about deeper connection with people. If you can inhabit that space of like, this is so exciting, and this is such a great way that we can really talk about our mission and get people excited, that energy will often rub off on other people and they will start to feel a little bit less judged, criticized, or like there's a right answer and a bit more curious and open. Then again, you might not feel that way about yourself, so don't worry if you're not full of joy about it. Instead, I would try and just model, just lead by example, model the change that you are trying to create in other people. You could even, this is almost a little bit, you could use the wrong word in a meeting and go, oops, I meant this other word. You can model that, you can just acknowledge it, catch the mistake and be like, sorry, I used the wrong name for that person. Of course, their name is this. And you're just modeling that you can take action in the moment and it doesn't mean that you're bad or terrible. And you can verbalize that. If it's a fit for your working environment, you can go, I'm just thinking out loud. Oh, it's a bit hard to find the right word, isn't it? I was going to say this, but now I think about it, if we describe this group as hard to reach, it's sort of putting the blame on them. And I wonder if we can think about how our services are hard to access. You can like do that thinking out loud. Again, it won't be a fit for every team. And three questions that I always ask myself when I hear someone using non-inclusive language, I ask me or not me, here or not here, now or not now. So is it me that is the best person to name this? If it is, I might go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why you said that. And try and be genuinely curious and not immediately hostile and immediately putting on the defense. Maybe they've said something really awful. Maybe you can be quite aggravated about it. But if not, try and be open and curious. You could also use techniques like a pause, just literally pausing and not replying after someone said something can be super powerful. And that can give them a second to reflect and be like, ooh, did I mean to say that? Again, it'll depend on your context. So think about if you're the right vehicle for the message, if that person trusts you and feels comfortable, and if it's likely to sort of explode. Don't challenge people if it's going to be unsafe for you. I would always put your personal safety first. So that me or not me question can be about effectiveness, but also about staying safe. Then you've got the now or not now question. A lot of people feel attacked if you call out in the moment. A lot of people feel more comfortable if afterwards you just say, I've just been having a think about what you said, and I wondered if dot dot dot. And you could say something like, I used to use that word too, but I just learned the history of it. Or actually, a friend who was in that community told me that it has this impact for them. Just thought you might like to know, and I'm just sharing it with you. So that can be a now or a not now thing. And then here or not here is like, are we going to do it right here in this meeting or in a reply to this email? Or is it a conversation a bit later? And you can take action whenever feels right for you. So please don't panic that you have to like have the answer ready in the moment. Often it's actually more effective and the other person is more on board if you've gone away and had a little think about it. And then you maybe say, I've just been thinking about it and I thought you might like to know this. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Ettie, thank you so much. We have run out of time, sadly. There are so many questions, and so many people just wanting to thank you for how interesting it was, how engaging you are as a speaker, how practical. It was full of really practical tips, and I've come away with a lot that I'm definitely going to want to put in practice. Thank you to everybody who's joined us this morning for this session. Ettie's email is in the chat. It will be part of the resource delegate pack afterwards as well. So it is time for us to call it a day there. But the next session starts at 11:45, so you've just got time to go and have a quick break, make a cup of tea, and settle back down. Thanks a lot.